Hello and welcome to another episode in the cancelled games series. This time we're not looking at a console but a home computer and my all-time favourite gaming system, the Commodore Amiga. Shout out to games that weren't, without whom this episode would have been very difficult. Check out the link to their site in the description to find more info on cancelled Amiga games and links to download some of the games mentioned in this video. As to be expected, due to the prevalence of bedroom coders and its long lifespan, the Amiga had an absolutely huge amount of unreleased titles. Join me as we take a look at 25 of those games. Babylonian Twins started development in 1993 after its creator was inspired by the smooth scrolling of Team 17's platform game Super Frog, released on the Amiga that year. The developers were three Iraqi students at a university in Baghdad. Obviously, being 1993, it wasn't exactly an ideal time to be developing a game in Iraq. The hope was to create something that painted Iraqi history in a more positive light given the recent events. It's a nice looking platformer, incredibly impressive actually considering the situation, and has smoothly animated motion that achieves the ambition of emulating Super Frog. The levels are well designed and varied, boasting an historic atmosphere with ancient Mesopotamian architecture, weapons, enemies and traps based on Babylonian times. The Persian style music is pretty damn good too. It stars a pair of young Babylonian princes as they endeavour to protect the land and its Mesopotamian treasure from an evil sorcerer who has cursed the land. It featured puzzle solving elements and lots of collectibles in the form of treasure. Sadly, with the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq following the Gulf War, they couldn't find a publisher, so Babylonian Twins was never released. In 2007, the creator, Rabah Shihab, uploaded a video about the game which garnered considerable interest in the Amiga community. Subsequently, a remastered version of Babylonian Twins has been released on iOS and Android, and it's thought that he may also run a Kickstarter campaign to finally release the original for the Amiga. In Shadow of Time was a point-and-click adventure game being developed by Swedish studio Shadow Elks. The development began in 1990 but underwent two conceptual overhauls in the next few years, with the third being started in 1994. The developers were inspired by, unsurprisingly, Monkey Island, but also Delphine's 1990 spy adventure Operation Stealth and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This entry does contain minor plot spoilers, so if you're playing through this or perhaps intend to, then maybe skip this one. The concept began with a more sinister plot in mind, but soon became a time travel themed comedy adventure. The game starts with an archaeologist uncovering a prehistoric cave containing alien technology, as well as some cave art depicting the face of the game's protagonist. Great Scott! We then join him as he wakes up at home and begin his adventure through time. The main character, Carl Tadpole, is dressed vaguely like Marty from Back to the Future, and there are other nods to classic time travel pop culture too, like the scientist's time machine that resembles an old outhouse. This travels through time in a similar manner to the phone box in Bill and Ted. Actually, it's very similar to 1993's Day of the Tentacle, which uses Portaloos as the time machines, although who knows who had the idea first considering the lengthy development time of In Shadow of Time. Again reminiscent of Back to the Future, you're pals with a wacky old scientist. He's the school's science teacher and you're his lab assistant / errand boy. When investigating the black box from the excavation site that has been sent to the professor, poor Carl accidentally activates a distress beacon. This is then intercepted by an alien craft, and Carl manages to offend them, prompting them to decide to destroy Earth as retribution. The player can travel to all manner of different locations, which in the first of the 4 chapters are situated in a town. The town can be navigated using a map which provides a bird's eye view of the area. At the end of the first chapter, the protagonist travels back in time for the first time, ending up in 1871, the Wild West. Tadpole's adventure through time as he attempts to save the world takes him from here to Sherwood Forest, where he meets Robin Hood and his band of merry men, to prehistoric times as hinted at in the intro, and even to a spaceship. There's a clever bit of copy protection early on in the game, although at the time you might not realise it. When you're in the scientist's lab near the game's beginning, you have the option to mix 3 chemicals together in varying quantities. The copy protection in the manual would instruct the player to mix these in the quantities 4, 1 and 3. Thing is, you can mix any combination of chemicals and it would work, having no consequences until a short while later when the mixture would blow you up. If you didn't know any better, you'd just think you were doing something wrong and would be stuck. An ingenious way of getting one over on video game pirates. The game was fully playable, being about 98% complete, but was missing some music and sound effects, and most importantly, wasn't actually completable. It was previewed in magazines Amiga Computing and CU Amiga in June of '97, but going by their comments it was still too early to make any real judgments. In 2006, the developers released some bug fixes which, for the first time, allowed players to complete the game. In Shadow of Time is a lovely little adventure game with some well thought out puzzles, vibrant 256 colour graphics and decent music. What a shame it never saw an official release. Fatal Noise was a versus fighter developed by Italian studio Digital Waves. There's very little information on this, although it was featured in an Italian magazine. Prototype was eventually released by the developers, but it's very buggy with several unfinished elements. The game's title screen portrays a copyright notice showing 1996, but work began on the project around 93 or 94. It originally had the name Fighting Cancer, but they soon very wisely changed it to Fatal Noise. The game emulated the popular early 90s fighters like Street Fighter, but was perhaps closer to some of the less successful like Team 17's Body Blows. It would have had 8 selectable fighters and 6 stages. Fatal Noise was cancelled sometime in or near 1996 because the development was only about a third of the way along and the Amiga was dying out as a platform, so it wasn't even presented to publishers. Although the prototype is technically playable, the enemy AI has not been implemented, so you won't have much fun kicking the shit out of an opponent who won't fight back. There are also several graphical assets missing and no sound effects, although the music was almost entirely finished and it's really good. Agricola is a platform game from a developer called Alchemy, which I believe is the correct pronunciation as I'm almost certain they're Italian. This starred a young farmer called Freddy who's awoken in the middle of the night by a loud bang and a bright light. After going back to sleep, he wakes up in the morning to find his farm's vegetables and insects have become giant mutated versions of themselves. Eventually he discovers the source of the noise and the flash of light. A meteor has crashed to Earth, which contains within it an alien base. These aliens have an evil plan to take over the Earth by mutating the planet's flora. Freddy's travels take him through levels that get progressively darker in tone, with a variety of locations including a spaceship. The graphics are nicely drawn and the music is reasonably good too. Work on Agricola began in 1991 and was 70 to 80% complete when it was cancelled in 1995. It was sent to several publishers, including Gremlin, Ocean and Core Design, but none were interested. A playable demo of Agricola is available online. ACSYS, which is an initialism for Autonomous Cybernetic System, was a platforming shooter being developed by German studio Unique Software. Obviously heavily inspired by Turrican, development started in 1995 and the team have said that in addition to Turrican they drew inspiration from Probotector and ACSYS on the Super Nintendo. It would have a mere 5 levels, but it was programmed in such a way that each level would be the equivalent of 3 to 4 levels of Turrican in size. Unique Software promised that there would be 0 load times during these levels too. This playable demo available online contains 1 level, but because of the scope it provides a reasonably large amount of gameplay. The latter half of the 90s wasn't the best time to be getting an Amiga game off the ground, so considering development didn't start till 95, it's not surprising that they couldn't find a publisher. When it was cancelled, the programming was about half done and around 70% of the graphics. The demo shows that graphically it was decent enough and has a good variety of enemies and smooth gameplay, but it's certainly no Turrican. I won't say much about Gore as I only have a few screenshots, but I just had to include it because it was being developed by DMA Design. If you're not familiar, they developed the Amiga smash Lemmings and went on to become Rockstar North. Development began on Gore around 1990, just after Lemmings. It was to be a fantasy side-scrolling beat-em-up, similar I suppose to games like Golden Axe. The idea was to push the Amiga's capabilities and be technically advanced, but this was perhaps its downfall. Test builds of the game kept running out of memory. Eventually, when Gore was at most 40% complete, their publisher Psygnosis shelved the project temporarily, which obviously ended up being permanent. I can find pretty much no information on Alchemy, not even the developer. Quite strange considering it was clearly developed to a reasonable stage and even had a 3-level playable preview available. This preview has an intro screen that does say "from Psygnosis", so perhaps they would have been the publisher. So all the knowledge we have on this is what we can ascertain from the preview. We can see from the display that it would have supported 2 players. The graphics are pretty good with nice chunky sprites. There doesn't look like there's much to do but walk around, the few enemies present don't move and can't be interacted with. Also, hazards like the spikes don't harm the character at all, and the score seems to be increasing purely through the player character existing, so this was likely a very early build. The animation is okay, but the jumping is terribly floaty. The preview has some varied backgrounds, and these backgrounds are quite detailed and by far the best thing about this. Part of the preview has music, which isn't bad at all, and actually has a Psygnosis feel to it, adding weight to the theory that they'd be publishing this. Who knows what the story would have involved, but with a name like Alchemy it's reasonable to assume that it would have had a magical element. Blast Squad was a planned Bomberman clone from a 2-man team at Mantasoft, originally named Bomber Blaster. Development started as late as 1999. This would support between 1 and 4 players, as you'd expect from a game striving to emulate Bomberman. It featured a story mode and a battle mode. The story mode plays much like any entry in the Bomberman series, with time limited levels and periodic boss battles. The graphics are quite nice, although nothing to write home about, but the music and sound effects are exceptional. Blast Squad was at some point abandoned when it was roughly 80% finished, as the project became too much for the 2-man team to handle. The game is fully playable though, and available to download. Harold the Harry Hermit was a puzzle platformer developed in 1993 and 94 by Interactive Imagination to be published by Rasputin. The idea is that Harold, tired of his life, heads off to live in the mountains with his trusty Dalmatian. She soon gives birth to puppies who promptly wander off, and Harold must gather them up and return them to his cave before their mother wakes up. There are 5 levels in all, each containing 3 stages and a boss to defeat, with each stage having a set number of puppies that need rounding up. A demo was shown at the European Computer Trade Show, but the game died when Rasputin went under. Paradise Lost was a side-scrolling action game based on the John Milton epic poem of the same name. Development was started in 1990 by Turkish duo Silicon Twins. They wanted to do with epic poems what Ocean had done with film licenses. This is a side-scrolling game that took inspiration from Shadow of the Beast and sees the protagonist running through levels and punching all manner of monstrous beasts. One section veers away from this perspective and is instead played from a third-person kinda Space Harrier viewpoint. The levels vary in design, some of which have a bit of a dodgy colour palette, and are mainly caverns and mountain paths with the odd ancient ruin thrown in the mix. Not the best graphics, although by no means awful, and the music is atmospheric albeit forgettable. The source material is a tale of Adam and Eve and their temptation by Satan. Presumably the player character here is Adam, although he looks like a topless flat-chested Wonder Woman. Levels end with a boss fight in the form of some giant creature who are all servants of Satan, but the end of the game tells you that you'll need to play the sequel to catch up with Satan himself. Also worth noting is that between each level you see a segment of Milton's poem. Paradise Lost's development lasted for 14 months, and in late 1991 the developers came to the UK to pitch the game to several potential publishers, including Elite, US Gold, Gremlin and Core Design. Unfortunately it wasn't picked up, so the pair instead self-published a small number in Istanbul. So technically it wasn't cancelled, just had a very limited Turkish release. It's estimated that at most a few hundred were sold. Paradise Lost was released as freeware in 2013. Star Gunner is a lovely little side-scrolling shooter released on DOS and Windows in 1996 by Apogee, which is the year they became 3D Realms, but an Amiga version was planned. The artwork, which is gorgeous, was actually drawn using deluxe paint on an Amiga. Although the plot in a shooter is pretty much irrelevant, and this one is the usual alien galaxy war kind of affair, it's worth mentioning the awesome Star Wars-like crawling text that introduces the story. This plays much like any horizontal shooter-like R-Type, with you piloting a ship through linear levels, collecting power-ups and blasting oncoming enemies. You can collect weapon and shield power-ups throughout the levels, but also credits which can be spent on ship upgrades. Star Gunner has everything you'd want in a shooter and a lot of it. A wide variety of 75 different enemies, and they come in large numbers, so there's always a lot going on screen. There are a whopping 34 levels and 33 bosses. The shop has a meaty selection of 22 upgrades, which give your ship special abilities or add various secondary weapons. Spending your collected credits on these and choosing them wisely will be vital. Apogee's intention was to develop Star Gunner for the Amiga and then port it to PC, but in the end only the PC versions were released. A real shame this never made it to the Amiga, because as I said, it has stunning graphics and top-notch music, so it would have been a real treat for Amiga owning shoot 'em up fans. If you want to play the PC version, it was released as freeware in 2005, so it's free on Steam. Desolate World was being developed around 1997 by a Czech studio to be published by Vulcan Software. This is an action platformer and looks absolutely stunning. If you're a Bitmap Brothers fan, you can immediately draw parallels with Gods, both graphically and in the gameplay. The colour palette is even similar to the muscular metallic character designs and stone walls of Gods. Desolate Worlds plays much the same. Your character plods around the levels, shooting enemies, flipping switches and collecting keys. It would also have puzzles to solve and some bosses to defeat. This early demo was created, which contains one solitary level, albeit of considerable size. This was sent to a couple of Czech magazines, but was ultimately cancelled. The devs tried to shift development of Desolate Worlds to the Game Boy Advance, but that never made it in the end either. Obviously, being a late 90s Amiga title, this was at a disadvantage from the get-go, but it looks like we could have lost a beautiful game here. Another game planned for the Amiga but only made it to PC was Bureau 13, a graphic adventure from Take-Two Interactive, published by GameTech. It came to DOS and Windows in '95, and the plan was to port the game to the 1200 and CD32. The story is based on the Bureau 13 role-playing games which started in the early 80s, following agents of a branch of government tasked with investigating the supernatural, kinda like the X-Files. The Bureau are trying to hunt down some dude who's wanted for attempted murder and want to get to him before the regular authorities do in case he blows the Bureau's cover. You select a team of 2 agents from a pool of several, some of whom are themselves supernatural in nature, like a witch and a vampire. I guess in the world of supernatural investigations the term "it takes one to know one" is applicable. Although it's based on a role-playing game, it's actually a point and click. The interface is about the only good thing about this game, using the familiar verb menu, but it's not great, it's just the best of a bad bunch. The rest of the game has so much wrong with it. The pace, the story and behaviour of the characters are all off, and the graphics look nice at face value but don't quite come together as a whole. Not the greatest loss on this list, but if you do want to play it, the DOS version is available on the abandonware sites. Putty came to the Amiga in 1992. You might have played the Super Nintendo version called Super Putty. A sequel was developed by System 3 and published in 1994 called Putty Squad. This was headed to the Amiga, Super Nintendo, Mega Drive and DOS, but in the end only the Super Nintendo version was released. Much like its predecessor, in Putty Squad you're controlling a little blob on a mission to save his mates. He can morph into several shapes, including a fist for attacks, and can float by inflating, stretch to climb higher platforms or cross gaps, and squish down to a puddle to collect items. The Amiga version was fully complete in 1994, and demos were even sent to magazines for release on cover discs. It was also quite widely reviewed, and achieved some very high praise. I have no idea why it wasn't released, but it does seem strange that a game that was entirely finished and was reviewing well would have been scrapped at that stage. It's a fun platforming game with really nice graphics and some cracking music. Finally, almost 2 decades later in 2013, the Amiga version was finally made available when System 3 released it on their website as a Christmas gift to fans. Until this time, Putty Squad had become one of the most desirable cancelled Amiga games. A remake was also released that year for modern platforms, so most likely the release of the Amiga version was a publicity stunt. This one you may be familiar with due to its recent comeback, Hardcore. This was a run and gun action platformer developed by Digital Illusions for the Amiga, Mega Drive and Mega CD to be published by ACSYS. Digital Illusions made the excellent Pinball Dreams on Amiga and its sequels, and you may know them as DICE. This footage is from the Mega Drive version, which has recently been released with the new name Ultra Core. You play as a soldier sometime in the future who must enter a lab being attacked by robots hell-bent on destroying mankind. There are 6 enemy-filled levels in which you'll encounter robotic enemies of all shapes and sizes, both on the ground and in the air. Hardcore perhaps took inspiration from Turrican with its level structure, so the levels are quite large and well thought out, with plenty of hidden areas and secrets to find. There are weapon upgrades to collect throughout, but these have limited ammunition, unlike your standard shot which is infinite. There are also keycards and security passes to collect, which grant entry to previously inaccessible areas. Hardcore's best quality is its stunningly drawn graphics, which look fantastic on this Mega Drive version running on the Mega SG, and have that signature early 90s Amiga look about them. Very nice indeed, and there's some great music too. Hardcore was apparently 99% complete in 1994 when publisher ACSYS decided to cancel it. They were moving to the PlayStation market at the time and saw platforms like the Amiga and Mega Drive as past their sell-by date. In 2018, Hardcore was finished by a team including a DICE co-founder and several former employees. This was done using an original Mega Drive dev kit and is due to be released by Strictly Limited Games at the end of August on PS4, Switch and Vita, with a limited run of 999 copies on the Mega Drive. Note that due to a licensing issue which arose due to ACSYS, now owned by Sony, owning the rights to Hardcore, it was renamed Ultra Core for this release. I messed up and missed the chance to grab a copy for the Mega Drive myself, but thankfully my mate ordered 2 and is kindly selling me one, so I can't wait to play this on original hardware. I just wish I could play the Amiga version. It was also included on the Mega SG console released earlier this year, on which this footage was recorded by Rob at Hellfire64, so it's nice to see the game made it out to fans eventually. Hostile Breed was a side-scrolling shooter with a twist. It incorporated a strategy element with its base management. This was being developed by Palace Software in the early 90s and was even reviewed in magazines in 1992, including Amiga Power, Amiga Format and CU Amiga. The story is set in a distant star system. Following an earthquake, a research base has been overrun with local plant and animal wildlife. It's your job to beat them back while managing the general upkeep of the base. The base itself is spread over 8 wings, and you can view the current status of each via a central computer terminal. To properly care for the base, you'll need to juggle all sorts of tasks, including maintaining the reactor and the distribution of power, ensuring the defence systems are fully functioning, and performing repairs. You'll also need to oversee the building of maintenance robots who repair any damage to the base. The computer will display warning messages for each wing, informing you of any pressing issues. This of course is a gross oversimplification of what's involved, but you get the idea. While striving to look after the base and its myriad issues, you'll also need to defend it. That's where the scrolling shooter aspect of the game comes in. You can fly your ship either left or right horizontally through the base's corridors, blasting the planet's flora and fauna to push back their invasion. There's even a puzzle section, making this quite the intriguing mixture of gameplay genres. Hostile Breed was cancelled when Palace liquidated and were bought by Titus, but they weren't interested in publishing this as it wasn't a good fit for them. Although interestingly, the intro to the prototype footage shows Titus branding, dated 1993. I believe it was entirely finished and is available to download. I'm going to cheat by including 2 games on this entry, as both of these were also to be released on a CD32 double pack. Liquid Kids and Snow Brothers were 1990 arcade games and were at some point headed to the Amiga. Snow Brothers plays a lot like Bobble and is really good, surprisingly addictive fun. Released in 1990 by Toaplan, it's a 2-player platforming game featuring 2 snowball tossing snowmen. Liquid Kids came to arcades the same year, this time developed by Taito. A wonderfully colourful platformer, it stars a platypus who can throw water bombs. These games are both perfect for the Amiga, especially considering the popularity of the Amiga ports of games like Bobble and New Zealand Story. Amiga ports of both Snow Brothers and Liquid Kids were completed. I'm not sure what happened to the former, but Liquid Kids was canned when the publisher Ocean decided not to release it. There are rumours that this had something to do with Taito not granting the rights, and some saying Ocean thought the game wasn't up to scratch. Either way, the games were as good as dead until the early 2000s when they were tracked down and made available online. Deep Silence, The Secret of My Soul was an RPG that started development around 97-98, very late for an Amiga game. Being made by a team of up to 15, it drew inspiration from Amber Star and Amber Moon, Breath of Fire, Wild Arms and of course the 2D Zelda games. Very little footage here apart from some early demo of a character walking through the woods. The frame rate is comically slow and has no sound, but there's a nice effect whereby clouds are floating overhead. The available screenshots tell us a little bit more, showing the in-game menu and hint at the inclusion of 3D cutscenes. There would also be anime style graphics. The developers said that Deep Silence's story was its most important aspect, as is true of any good RPG, and promised a quote epic anime adventure. Deep Silence was scrapped when it was about 30% complete. Nobodies Land was a platform game developed by Eternal and published by Xposed Software. This was planned for the Amiga but ended up being an Atari ST exclusive, and it's the ST version that you're seeing here. You play as Bud, who has to ascend to heaven to ask for help saving his land from impending floods. There are 5 levels, taking Bud higher and higher on his journey to heaven. The levels are littered with enemies in the form of various animals, a lot of traps and numerous platforms to jump to. He's armed with a pistol to take out enemies. Jumps can be tricky for 2 reasons. The jumping is a bit ropey and some of the platforms are quite hard to spot. Take this one made of grey rock for example. At first glance it looks like it's part of the grey stone wall that makes up the background. The higher Bud goes, the higher the flood waters will rise. You can collect coins throughout the levels, and these can be spent in shops you'll find along the way, wherein you can buy upgrades. The graphics are pretty decent for an early 90s game, but the colour palette could certainly benefit from some variety. The music is great and very upbeat. Nobodies Land came to the ST in 1991, but the Amiga version never emerged. City Limits was a demo developed in 1988 and 1989 by Mutation Software and was pitched to Psygnosis. Being a demo used purely to demonstrate the concept, there's not much to it, but it certainly does what it was intended to. It was a racing game which would take you all across the USA, taking part in races in either a Porsche, Lamborghini or Lotus. The game has a top-down perspective similar to Miami Chase, and the demo contains some small and relatively simple tracks. The graphics are polished and the gameplay seems very smooth. The speed that the car can reach is considerable, so this could well have been a fast-paced and very competitive multiplayer game. The music's brilliant, but I'm not sure it fits with the game. Presumably Psygnosis didn't pick city limits up, so this was added to Mutation's list of unreleased games. Noby The Aardvark was a platform game being developed by Northern Ireland based Genesis, who had created a few platformers for Codemasters and was published by Thalamus on the Commodore 64. It starred Nobby, a blue aardvark who kinda reminds me of the pink aardvarks in the 80s cartoon The Raccoons. An Amiga version was planned, a prototype of which you're seeing here. This is your standard platformer with Nobby leaping about avoiding enemies. He can suck ants out of anthills strewn throughout the levels and then spit these ants at enemies. Enemies consist of various wildlife, including Tasmanian devils resembling Taz. He's on a quest to find the fabled land of Antopia, a place rumoured to have an endless supply of tasty ants. The developers missed a trick there, not calling it Antlantis. Nobby's adventures take him through 5 levels, including one in the air in a hot air balloon, one underwater, and one in a submarine, which then takes him to the final level in the lost city of Atlantis. This is quite different from the C64 version. For a start, Nobby's blue instead of grey. There are also more levels in the C64 version, and most have different locations. Games that weren't managed to retrieve a disc containing a working prototype of Noby The Aardvark from the developers, in which the first 4 levels are playable. It was never finished, being only about 50% complete. Despite this, it was reviewed in 2 magazines. Strange to review an incomplete game, but this was commonplace back in the Amiga days. Justice was a 3D shooter being developed by Extreme Software Development, which began in 1993. An early demo was created containing a single level, but the final version would have had 6 levels of open free roaming gameplay, offering various terrain including an underwater level. The graphics have a 3D style reminiscent of the Super Nintendo Star Fox, which doesn't look too impressive these days, but it was phenomenal in 1993. The play area is quite large, and you can use your on-screen radar to fly around hunting for enemy aircraft, which can then be shot down. The demo's music is very good too, with some reasonably good sound effects. Obviously the Justice demo didn't drum up any business, which is a shame because the Amiga didn't have enough games like this. Indigo was a visually impressive platformer which began development sometime between 91 and 93. Programmed by Stefan Berlin for the Atari ST, it was due to be published in late 93 by Psygnosis on the Amiga and ST. Stefan not only coded the game, but did pretty much everything including the graphics and sound. His friend Domenico Manfredi handled the Amiga port. Indigo's story has an odd premise. You play as a young lad called Jack, who ventures inside his drawing book to rescue his imaginary friend, the titular Indigo, who has been trapped inside it. Indigo is some weird bull with arms and eyes, but you never see him in game, apart from in stills between levels and at the game's end. The aim is to collect all the keys in a level in order to open the exit, and do so within a given time limit. Keys are either dotted around the level or collected from fallen enemies. Jack wears a football helmet and can throw footballs as projectile weapons. He can also jump on enemies' heads to stun them, and then pick them up to lob them at other enemies. He can collect several power-ups to help him. These range from the standard things like bombs and time extenders, but the most exciting is a Superman-like power-up which grants him the ability to fly and shoot lasers out of his eyes. As I said, this is quite nice graphically with really nice and chunky sprites, and the music is very good too. Not reinventing the wheel gameplay wise though, but could have been a reasonably fun platformer. Despite the publishing contract with Psygnosis going through in 1992, Indigo was cancelled at some point in 93, at which point it was all but finished. Where Time Stood Still was developed by Denton Designs and published in 1988 by Ocean for the Spectrum, Atari ST and DOS. Amiga versions never emerged until 2014 when some fans ported the Atari ST version. It's an isometric adventure game which follows a party of 4 plane crash survivors after they crash in the Himalayas. They soon discover that the area is inhabited by hostile indigenous tribespeople and dinosaurs. It's all very 50s B-movie. The box art is even stylised like the old films where humans are thrust back to prehistoric times. The unlucky quartet must navigate their way through the dangerous terrain while ensuring they also stay rested and nourished. The player uses a mouse and menu of icons and can use this to control the 4 characters and interact with objects. Each team member has his or own skills and weaknesses and will whine incessantly if they don't get enough food or sleep. Searching for items along the way is essential to prevent your team from getting hungry, tired, or even dying. The Amiga port of the ST version even added a few little extra tweaks, like a comic book style intro and an enhanced soundtrack. Flower, which is an acronym for the Love of the World Enchanted Road, was a platform game developed by Sunny Design in 1994. Inspired by platformers of the era like Rodland and Rainbow Islands, and does remind me a bit of Chucky Egg, it follows a very similar format. It's simple, your little elf-like character runs and jumps around the levels collecting items and shooting enemies. Enemies are a mixture of things like jesters, creatures and inanimate objects come to life like walking playing cards. It has a bit of an Alice in Wonderland feel to it. It would also contain minigames which would unlock secret areas and award power-ups. I have no idea if they had any publishers lined up for Flower or if it was even pitched, but a demo was created and it was about 80% complete when cancelled. So that was 25 of the many unreleased Amiga games. Let me know in the comments if any of them appeal to you, and as always, thanks for watching. You can find the other episodes in my cancelled game series in this playlist.